The Cry in the Cemetery. In the quiet town of Elmwood, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, there is a cemetery that few dare to visit after dark. By day, Elmwood Cemetery appears serenely a picturesque resting place, with rows of weathered headstones, towering oaks, and moss-covered crypts. But when the sun sets and the shadows stretch long, the cemetery transforms into something else entirely. It becomes a place of whispers, chills, and, most famously, the sound of crying. For decades, residents have reported hearing the mournful wails of what sounds like a woman, her sobs rising and falling like a lament carried on the wind. The cries are said to echo through the empty grounds, beginning faintly, almost imperceptibly, before growing louder, more desperate. Witnesses describe the sound as unmistakably human, raw, filled with sorrow, and deeply unsettling. Many have tried to explain the cries. Some believe they are the echoes of a grieving mother, mourning a loss too great to bear. Others think it might be the spirit of a forgotten soul, buried in an unmarked grave. Still, others dismiss the phenomenon as the result of overactive imaginations or natural sounds amplified by the cemetery's eerie stillness. But those who have heard the cries firsthand rarely dismiss them so easily. The legends surrounding Elmwood Cemetery have grown over the years, fed by the chilling accounts of those brave or foolish enough to visit after dark. One of the most infamous tales comes from a local groundskeeper named Henry, who worked at the cemetery for over 30 years. Henry was known for his pragmatism and skepticism, often scoffing at the ghost stories shared by visitors. But one night, as he was locking the gates, he heard. It started as a soft sob, Henry once recounted. I thought maybe someone had stayed behind, mourning a loved one. But when I called out, there was no response. The crying got louder, moving through the cemetery like it was coming from everywhere at once. It was the most sorrowful sound I've ever heard. Henry searched the grounds that night but found no one. The experience left him shaken, and he refused to work night shifts. Other stories are more unnerving. A teenager who snuck into the cemetery on a dare claimed to see a faint figure standing among the gravestones. It was the silhouette of a woman, he said, her head bowed as if in mourning. When he called out to her, she turned, but instead of a face, there was only darkness. He fled, vowing never to return. The most compelling part of the legend revolves around a specific location within the cemetery. A small, unmarked grave near the western end. Locals believe this is where the cries originate, though no one knows who lies buried there. The grave is old, the marker so worn that any inscription has long since disappeared. One account tells of a paranormal investigator who visited Elmwood Cemetery to document the cries. Armed with recording equipment, he set up near the unmarked grave just after midnight. For hours, nothing happened. But as the clock struck 3:00 a.m., the temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy. The investigator later described hearing a faint voice on his audio recorder, one that wasn't audible at the time. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, and repeated a single word: "Help." His recording captured something else as well: faint footsteps circling the grave, though no one was present. He left before dawn, deeply unsettled by what he had experienced. Over the years, a pattern has emerged among those who hear the cries. The sound often begins faintly, as if coming from a great distance. Witnesses report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness and dread, as though the weight of the sorrow were pressing down on them. Some describe seeing strange phenomena accompanying the cries: flickering lights that dance among the gravestones, sudden gusts of cold wind, or shadows that seem to move independently of any light source. One particularly chilling account came from a hunter who happened to pass by the cemetery one evening. As he walked along the perimeter, he heard the crying and turned to see a figure kneeling by the unmarked grave. The figure appeared to be a woman, her face buried in her hands. But as he stepped closer, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of roses. Despite the stories, Elmwood Cemetery remains a functional burial ground, though few visit willingly after sunset. Paranormal enthusiasts and thrill-seekers occasionally venture in, drawn by the promise of encountering the unexplained. Some return with stories of strange occurrences: whispers, flickering lights, or the feeling of being watched. Others experience nothing unusual but speak of an oppressive atmosphere that lingers long after they leave. To this day, no one knows the true origin of the cries. Are they the echoes of a tragedy long forgotten, the restless spirit of someone wronged in life, or perhaps something darker, beyond human comprehension. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Elmwood Cemetery is not a place to be taken lightly. For those who dare to listen, the cries serve as a haunting reminder that some sorrows are too great to fade, even in. Over the years, more stories emerged from Elmwood Cemetery, each one adding layers to its already chilling reputation. Residents of the nearby town began to notice patterns. The cries were most often heard on misty nights, particularly in the weeks leading up to the anniversary of a great flood that had swept through the area nearly a century ago. The flood had claimed dozens of lives, many of whom were buried in unmarked graves within the cemetery's older sections. Visitors reported a variety of strange occurrences beyond the cries themselves. Some described feeling an invisible presence brushing past them or a sudden chill that made their breath visible in the summer air. Others spoke of hearing faint footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. One account, passed down for generations, tells of a traveling salesman named Arthur who sought shelter in the cemetery during a sudden storm. He claimed to have heard the cries while huddled under the canopy of an ancient oak tree. When he ventured toward the sound, he found a small gravestone partially submerged in the muddy earth. According to Arthur, the crying grew louder as he approached, but the moment he reached out to touch the stone, the sound ceased, replaced by a woman's voice whispering, "You shouldn't be here." Arthur left the cemetery that night and never returned to Ridgewood, his story serving as both a warning and a curiosity to those who heard it. While the cries are the most famous phenomenon, they are not the only supernatural element tied to Elmwood Cemetery. Several witnesses have described seeing fleeting apparitions near the unmarked grave, believed to be the source of the sounds. These apparitions are often of a woman in mourning attire, her features obscured by a thick veil. She is said to kneel by the grave, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Others have reported encountering shadowy figures that linger near the mausoleums, their forms indistinct and shifting like smoke. These figures don't interact with visitors but are often accompanied by a profound sense of unease. Perhaps the most disturbing sightings involve the cemetery's infamous oak tree, under which many of the unmarked graves are located. On certain nights, glowing orbs of light have been seen floating among its branches, pulsing softly as if alive. Those brave enough to approach the tree often describe hearing faint whispers emanating from the ground below, as though the earth itself were speaking. One paranormal investigator who visited the site claimed to have captured an EVP electronic voice phenomenon near the tree. The recording, when played back, revealed a faint voice pleading, "Find me." Despite its haunted reputation, Elmwood Cemetery has become a magnet for thrill seekers and paranormal enthusiasts. Groups often sneak in after dark, armed with cameras, recording devices, and thermal scanners, hoping to capture evidence of the unexplained. One such group, made up of college students, documented their encounter on social media. According to their account, they heard the cries shortly after midnight, echoing from the direction of the unmarked grave. As they approached, the sound grew deafening, almost unbearable. Their footage, shaky and grainy, shows the group standing in a tight circle as the cries suddenly. Seconds later, a faint glowing mist rises from the grave, swirling around them before dissipating into the night. "We thought it was just a story," one of the students later said, but when you're standing there and you hear it for yourself, you realize it's something much bigger. It's not just a ghost story, it's. Over time, historians and paranormal researchers have tried to piece together the history of Elmwood Cemetery to better understand its haunted reputation. Records show that the cemetery was established in the early 1800s during a period of rapid settlement in the region. The unmarked graves, believed to be the source of much of the activity, were likely the result of several tragedies. In addition to the Great Flood, the area was also struck by a deadly influenza outbreak in the late 19th century. With limited resources and overwhelmed burial grounds, many of the deceased were hastily interred without proper markers or One name that frequently comes up in local lore is that of Abigail Whitmore, a widow whose child was swept away during the flood. Unable to find her son's body, Abigail was said to have spent her final years wandering the cemetery, searching for any trace of him. She died penniless and alone, and her grave remains unmarked to this day. Many believe it is Abigail's cries that echo through the cemetery on misty nights, her sorrowful wails a testament to her eternal grief. While some visitors claim to have experienced closure or connection during their time in Elmwood Cemetery, others leave with more questions than answers. The whispers, the apparitions, and the chilling cries remain unexplained, defying scientific reason. Skeptics argue that the phenomena are the result of natural causes: wind passing through the trees, wildlife moving among the gravestones, or the psychological effects of fear in a dark, isolated place. But for those who have stood in the cemetery and heard the sobs, felt the cold, and seen the shadows, the explanations fall short. One researcher summed it up best: Elmwood Cemetery is not just haunted, it is alive with memory, with sorrow, and with a history that refuses to rest. To this day, Elmwood Cemetery remains a place of beauty and fear, where life and death seem to intertwine. Visitors are drawn to its haunting allure, whether out of curiosity, reverence, or the hope of uncovering its secret. But those who venture too close to the unmarked grave often leave with an unshakable feeling that they were not alone, and that whatever lingers there is watching, waiting, and weeping.